Hello, everyone. Welcome to 3.3. At this point, we've talked a bit about the background of the book, and you've read the first three chapters, so you have a bit of a sense of Peter's life and what he's trying to say. In 3.3, we're going to continue on through chapters 4 and 5 and talk specifically about the structure of the book, because as you've probably noticed, it can be a bit complicated and a bit confusing at times. So first, let's define narrative structure. Narrative means a story, anything with, beginning, middle, and end, and structure is how something is organized or set up. So how the book is organized is what we're looking at with narrative structure. And you can also think of it as the map or outline of a story. How does each piece fit together? If we think back to A Raisin in the Sun, which we read all the way back in first semester, well, Raisin in the Sun has a pretty simple narrative structure. It is just one storyline, start to finish. We start one morning and see how the events of the next several days play out, just moving forward in time. Simple Recipes, on the other hand, is mostly focused on a main narrative, but Theanne also jumps forward to her perspective as an adult, thinking back to her childhood. So we get glimpses of her as an adult and a main story of her as a child. And the story jumps around a bit more. It's not as straightforward and linear as A Raisin in the Sun. So, what about While the Locust Slept? In this story, we are looking at what's called a two-timeline narrative structure. Bit of a mouthful, but the name tells you exactly what it is. It is the organization of a story using two separate timelines. In the case of While the Locust Slept, you might have noticed that we seem to be jumping around between two different times. But before we dive into that, let's start with another example. One more popular example of something that uses a two-timeline narrative structure could be The Princess Bride, the book or the movie version. The movie starts off with a grandfather telling a story to his sick son in the present day. But then it jumps back, and much of the story is this fantastical timeline of what's happening within the book. It doesn't stay there, though. Throughout the movie, we jump back to the boy and his grandfather, and then back to the fantasy realm, so we move freely between these two timelines. That's two-timeline narrative structure. So in While the Locust Slept, we can see this in many places in the book. Here's an example from chapter 3. When Peter is talking with Geordie, a new friend that he's met while at the Schollses, he's talking in one timeline. But then he has a flashback. News of Emmett's death brought it all rushing back, and he jumps back to when he was much younger, living in the state school. So if we break this one tiny piece of the story up, the bottom paragraph there is from the past timeline, Peter's memories from the state school when he was 1 to 15 years old. And that top paragraph is from the current timeline, Peter's life after leaving the school on farm placement. The book moves pretty freely between these two timelines, and it can sometimes be a bit confusing to keep track of where we are in Peter's story, so we have to pay a bit of attention. So, why do this if it can be a little confusing? There are a number of effects we can see that you get from a two-timeline narrative, both in While the Locust Slept and some of the other examples we've looked at. All of them have different purposes for using this structure. The main one, usually, is that it can create connections between events. As in that example in Locust, we see Peter being reminded of a past trauma by something he's enduring in the present. He feels that link, so we, the reader, are shown it as well. This can also be a great way to show a character's reaction to something. Especially in The Princess Bride, we get to see the grandson reacting to what happens in the story. And in While the Locust Slept, we get to see what comes to Peter's mind as he's experiencing these different things. This structure can also build curiosity and tension. It's confusing, so we wonder, why are these pieces put together in this way? What's going to happen next? How does this piece relate to the other? It makes us want to keep reading and learn those answers. And finally, it can feel more authentic to the narrator's train of thought. Our minds are messy. We don't think in a very organized point A to point B. We think of random things that pop up from time to time. So, by using this two timeline narrative structure, we get to put ourselves a bit in the author's shoes and see their actual thought process instead of something that feels like it's been really polished and perfected for us. As you keep reading chapters 4 and 5 in this lesson, you'll see plenty more examples of how this two timeline narrative structure comes up. Keep an eye out for it. See if you can start to think about why Peter Razor might jump from one timeline to another and how it impacts you as a reader. Happy reading!